The night was heavy with silence, the kind that clings to the air before a storm breaks. Cameras had long stopped flashing, and the last of the media vans had rolled away from Montecito's winding roads. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Yet, inside one secluded mansion, behind the elegant glass doors that had witnessed laughter, tears, and countless whispered arguments, a single light remained on. It was here, away from royal courtiers, cameras, and protocol, that Prince Harry of Windsor, once the heart and soul of the modern monarchy, finally broke his silence. His voice trembled not with anger this time, but with the unbearable weight of truth. At 41, Prince Harry has lived more lives than most men do in a lifetime. He has been the adored son of a princess, the grieving boy walking behind a coffin the world could not stop watching, the rebellious soldier, the royal outcast, and finally, the self-exiled husband and father trying to redefine his legacy on foreign soil. But nothing, neither wars nor tabloids, prepared him for the night he admitted to the one truth that would shatter his identity entirely. "The DNA results," he said quietly, his eyes glassy. "They confirmed it. Archie and Lilibet. They're not biologically mine." There are moments in history when a revelation doesn't just make headlines. It rewrites them. This was one of those moments. The world has always been captivated by Prince Harry's contradictions. A man born into privilege yet obsessed with freedom, a royal who traded castles for California sun, and a husband who defied an empire for love. But this confession went beyond rebellion or controversy. It struck at the very foundation of blood, lineage, and trust, three elements upon which the House of Windsor has stood for centuries. How did it come to this? How did the once beloved prince, once seen holding his newborn son in a tender embrace on the steps of Windsor Castle, reach a point where he would publicly question the paternity of his own children? What events unfolded behind closed doors that led to this irreversible truth? And what does this revelation mean, not just for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, but for the royal institution itself, and for the two innocent children caught at the center of the world's most scrutinized family drama? To understand this moment, we must go back, not to the palace gates, but to the emotional battlefield that has defined Prince Harry's adulthood. His life has been a series of wounds, both inherited and self-inflicted. The shadow of Princess Diana's death left him haunted, shaping a man desperate for genuine connection but deeply distrustful of those who offered it. For years, the British press painted him as a wild rebel, the party prince, the royal misfit. But behind the headlines was a man nursing invisible scars. When Meghan Markle entered his world, she didn't just offer love, she offered rescue. To Harry, she was the person who finally saw the man behind the monarchy. In the early years, their story felt like a modern fairy tale, the first biracial duchess, the rebellious prince, the symbolic union of tradition and progress. Crowds cheered, cameras flashed, and headlines hailed a new era for the monarchy. Yet, what looked like a triumph on the outside was already unraveling from within. The weight of expectation, cultural collision, and media persecution began eroding their peace. By the time they stepped back from royal duties, the fairy tale had turned into survival. Friends close to the couple described those years as a slow implosion. Harry's ties to his family grew colder, and Meghan's relationship with the institution turned openly hostile. They sought a new start in America, a world away from palace walls and judgmental courtiers. But exile doesn't heal the past, it magnifies it. In Montecito, with no royal obligations to distract him and no palace machine to shield him, Harry began to wrestle with truths he had long suppressed. Doubt, once a whisper, began to grow louder. It began innocently enough, or at least that's how one insider described it. Harry reportedly noticed inconsistencies, small, almost invisible details that gnawed at him late at night. Archie's eyes, Lilibet's hair, the faint resemblances that didn't quite align with family traits. He brushed them off at first, attributing them to coincidence, genetics, or stress. But as tension between him and Meghan deepened, so too did the silence that lived between them. It wasn't just about family or fame anymore, it was about trust. People who have spent time around the couple say that Harry became increasingly introspective, even paranoid. He started confiding in old friends and therapists, talking about lineage, identity, and the meaning of fatherhood. The more he spoke, the more he realized he couldn't shake one haunting question. What if everything I've built my new life on is based on a lie? It wasn't about accusation at first. It was about truth-seeking, about reclaiming control in a life that had been controlled by others since birth. And so, quietly, privately, he arranged a DNA test. Something so personal, so intimate that he told no one. The logistics were done through trusted contacts, outside the public eye. There were no courtiers, no PR advisors, just a man facing a question that could destroy him. When the envelope arrived, thick and unassuming, Harry reportedly sat in his study for hours before opening it. What was inside didn't just answer a question, it fractured his reality. But before we get there, before we reach that devastating reveal, we must understand the psychological terrain that led him there. Prince Harry has always carried a deep fear of betrayal. In every chapter of his life, from his mother's tragedy to the media's exploitation, betrayal has been his recurring theme. When Diana died, it wasn't just a mother he lost. It was the only person who made him feel safe in a world built on performance. In his adult years, when he finally found love, he clung to it fiercely, protecting it at all costs, even at the cost of his family ties. Yet, life has a cruel way of testing the very foundations we defend most passionately. In the months leading up to the confession, Harry's demeanor began to shift. Friends noticed the change. Fewer public appearances, shorter temper, sleepless nights. He was drinking less but isolating more, spending hours walking the garden paths of Montecito alone. When Meghan's team began pushing new projects, Harry appeared distant, disengaged. It was as though he was carrying a truth he could neither confront nor conceal. The revelation didn't happen in front of cameras or journalists. It began as a private reckoning. Sources close to the couple claim that Harry confided in a close friend, saying, "I thought the truth would set me free, but now, I don't even know who I am." Those words echo the depth of what this story represents. Not just a scandal, but an identity crisis that pierces through the illusion of royal life. The monarchy has always been built on the sanctity of bloodline. Every title, every privilege, every ounce of royal authority flows through the veins of heredity. So when a prince declares that his children may not carry his blood, it isn't merely personal, it's existential. It shakes the symbolic pillars of continuity the crown relies upon. And for Harry, who has already been stripped of royal duties and estranged from his family, this truth threatens to isolate him completely. Yet, this isn't just a story of revelation, it's also a story of liberation. Beneath the heartbreak lies a strange kind of peace. Harry, for all his anguish, is no longer living behind a curated image. His confession, though catastrophic in public perception, is an act of defiance against deceit, whether royal, marital, or personal. For the first time, perhaps, he isn't hiding behind palace walls or Netflix contracts. He's simply telling the truth regardless of the cost. In the coming sections, we'll trace how this confession unfolded, from the quiet beginnings of doubt to the explosive aftermath that sent shockwaves through both Buckingham Palace and Hollywood. We'll explore the ripple effects it has on the royal institution, the emotional toll on Meghan Markle, and what it means for Archie and Lilibet's future. But before we dive into that storm, we must pause on this moment, the night Harry finally faced himself. Because behind the headlines, behind the scandal and speculation, is a man sitting alone, staring into a mirror, and asking a question few dare to voice. If blood doesn't make a family, then what does? And as the night deepened over California, the answer remained as elusive as the truth itself. In the years following the wedding that captivated the world, the image of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle seemed unshakable. A portrait of unity, modern love, and rebellion against outdated tradition. On that bright May morning in 2018, millions tuned in across continents to witness the royal and the actress pledge their vows beneath the vaulted ceiling of St. George's Chapel. The music swelled, the flowers framed every frame perfectly, and it appeared as though history itself was turning a gentler page. To many, This was the beginning of a new kind of monarchy, one infused with empathy, diversity, and hope. To Harry, it was supposed to be redemption. To Meghan, perhaps it was destiny. But every story has a shadow, and this one was already forming behind the applause. The world saw the smiles, the carriage rides, and the radiant photographs. Few noticed the strain behind them. Inside the palace, whispers traveled faster than the wind. Meghan was seen as too opinionated, too independent, too unwilling to conform. Harry, ever the protective son of Diana, took her side without hesitation, and in doing so, drew a quiet but immovable line between himself and the institution that had defined him since birth. The tension was subtle at first. A cold glance here, an ignored phone call there. But soon, it hardened into full estrangement. By the time Meghan was pregnant with Archie, their fairy tale was already laced with disillusionment. The birth of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor should have been a moment of joy that bridged those divides. Yet even that event carried an air of unease. Meghan's pregnancy was shrouded in secrecy. She and Harry chose a private hospital, declined the traditional post-birth photo outside the Lindo wing, and refused to confirm key details to the press. The British tabloids, long masters at reading silence, began to fill in the blanks. Was Meghan's reluctance about privacy? Or was there something deeper beneath the surface? That speculation, whispered and often cruel, would become the seed of many conspiracies that followed. But in those early days, Harry dismissed them as noise, the same old prejudice and intrusion that had hounded his mother. Still, something about the atmosphere around Archie's arrival felt different. The palace's official statements were short, hesitant, almost mechanical. Photos released days later showed the new parents beaming proudly, but the stiffness in Harry's smile didn't go unnoticed by those who knew him well. Friends said he was tired, overwhelmed, and struggling to adjust. He had wanted this fatherhood, independence, love without limits, but already he was beginning to sense that happiness, when you are born into royalty, is never given freely. It is borrowed, fragile, and always under watch. Life in the United Kingdom grew increasingly unbearable for the Sussexes. Every move Meghan made seemed to spark another media storm. Every word Harry spoke was dissected and misinterpreted. There was the issue of staff turnover, of alleged rudeness, of broken royal protocols. To the outside world, these were palace dramas. To Harry, they were proof that the family he thought would protect him had become his enemy. It was not one single event that pushed them to leave. It was 1,000 paper cuts, a slow suffocation of trust. When they finally announced their decision to step back from royal duties in early 2020, the world reacted with shock, but Harry felt only relief. For the first time, he believed he could breathe. In those early months in America, the fairy tale seemed reborn. Sunlight, open space, freedom, California offered everything London could not. Interviews with close friends painted a picture of contentment. Morning walks, backyard barbecues, Meghan planting lavender with Archie by her side. Yet beneath that idyllic surface, the emotional distance between Harry and the rest of his family deepened into a chasm. Calls to his brother went unanswered. Messages to his father were filtered through aides. The man once celebrated as the people's prince was now a symbol of division. And while the media focused on the rift between Harry and William, few realized that a more personal rift, far quieter, far more dangerous, was growing inside his home. When Lilibet was born, that old anxiety returned. The pregnancy announcement was crafted for maximum charm. A black and white photo of Meghan resting her head in Harry's lap, sunlight pouring through the trees. It went viral within minutes. But privately, Harry's excitement was tempered by exhaustion. Meghan's insistence on total control over doctors, over details, over how the story was presented, reminded him of the very environment he'd fled. The royal institution had been replaced by another kind of structure, one equally rigid in its pursuit of perfection. The fairy tale that began with passion and purpose was quietly transforming into a cage of its own making. For those watching from the outside, it was easy to romanticize their American chapter. Deals with streaming platforms, humanitarian initiatives, public speeches about mental health and equality. All of it painted the picture of a couple thriving beyond the monarchy's shadow. But behind closed doors, Meghan and Harry were struggling. The pressures of fame without the protection of the crown had left them vulnerable. And as the cameras rolled and contracts demanded authenticity, their private world grew smaller, lonelier, and increasingly tense. The line between love and performance began to blur. Harry, now in his late 30s, often reflected on his mother's legacy. He wanted to be the kind of father Diana would have wanted him to be, present, protective, and emotionally honest. But even as he spoke publicly about fatherhood, a quiet doubt began to creep in. Friends say it was subtle at first, passing remarks, curious questions. He would look at Archie's face and wonder who he resembled more. He'd compare baby photos, searching for echoes of his own childhood expression. It wasn't suspicion that drove him. It was confusion, an unexplainable distance he couldn't articulate. In interviews, Harry often said that fatherhood changed everything. He described the joy of watching his children grow, their laughter, their innocence. Yet, those who knew him best noticed a contradiction. His words glowed with love, but his eyes carried a flicker of unease. It was as if he was trying to convince himself that he fully belonged to this new life. But deep down, some part of him sensed that the truth he was avoiding would one day demand to be faced. Meghan, for her part, continued to navigate the relentless scrutiny that had followed her from Palace to Hollywood. She threw herself into causes, production meetings, and public appearances, while Harry retreated further inward. What had once bonded them, the shared defiance against the establishment, was now driving them apart. Arguments became more frequent. The same headlines that once fueled their unity were now tearing at their bond. The couple who once vowed to stand against the world began standing apart within the same walls. The turning point, as many close to them would later recall, was not a fight but a silence. It was the growing gap between their conversations, the unspoken thoughts left hanging in the air. Harry felt it most in quiet moments, tucking Archie into bed, holding Lilibet's hand, and feeling a strange disconnect he couldn't explain. He began journaling, something his therapist had encouraged. Page after page, he wrote not about Meghan or the press, but about his fear of being deceived again, as he had been by institutions, friends, and fate. It was a fear so deep, it made him question even the bonds he cherished most. To the outside world, the Sussexes remained an emblem of resilience. But inside that Montecito mansion, cracks were widening. The fairy tale, once heralded as a triumph of love over tradition, was revealing itself as a cautionary tale about trust, fame, and isolation. What began as a rebellion against the palace had turned into a quiet war within their own home. And in that growing void, Harry's search for truth was no longer about family approval or royal duty. It was about survival. He needed to know who he was, and whether the life he'd built was grounded in love or illusion. The story of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle began with a kiss that defied centuries of royal convention. But as time would reveal, the foundation of that defiance carried a cost neither could have foreseen. The perfect royal fairy tale that started with a carriage ride and vows beneath cathedral light would, years later, lead to a private confession in the dead of night. A confession that would echo far beyond the walls of their California estate. Because in the world of royalty, truth is never just personal. It's political, historical, and profoundly human. And as Harry would soon learn, even the purest love can be undone by the secrets it tries to protect. The tension inside the palace had always been invisible to the cameras. It didn't show in the polished photographs or the choreographed waves from Buckingham Palace's balcony. It lived in corridors, between formal greetings, behind shut doors, inside glances that lasted a second too long. For years, that tension simmered quietly, but after Harry's marriage to Meghan Markle, it transformed into something far less manageable. What began as subtle unease became open estrangement, and eventually Cold War. Inside the monarchy, image is everything. There are no spontaneous gestures, no offhand remarks. Every smile is rehearsed, every hand placement deliberate. Yet Harry was never built for that kind of control. His energy was raw, emotional, and sometimes reckless. He was his mother's son, a heart that beat louder than protocol allowed. When Meghan entered that carefully curated world, she didn't just challenge its traditions. She exposed its fragility. For a while, Harry believed they could withstand it together. But even as they presented a united front, forces within and beyond the palace walls began to pry them apart. It started with whispers, anonymous staff briefings to the press, headlines hinting at diva demands, and difficult Duchess behavior. Harry saw in those stories the same cruelty that had destroyed his mother. He begged palace officials to issue statements defending Meghan, but their responses were measured, hesitant, or non-existent. He interpreted their silence as betrayal. Meghan interpreted it as racism. The couple grew closer in defiance, but with each passing month, they were also isolating themselves further from the only family Harry had left. The Queen, always the diplomat, tried to soothe the fracture with her quiet patience. She adored her grandson but viewed his rebellion as dangerous. Charles oscillated between sympathy and frustration, torn between paternal concern and the pressures of being king in waiting. The tension between Harry and Meghan became palpable even to those closest to them. Friends noticed how their conversations had shifted from shared dreams to unspoken resentments. Meghan's focus was forward projects, branding, influence. Harry's was backward, family, memory, the pain of the past. They began living parallel lives in the same home. He retreated into silence. She filled that silence with noise. Their disagreements, once hushed, turned into arguments that lingered in the air long after they ended. And through it all, their children became their only point of agreement, the fragile bridge keeping them from drifting apart completely. In this atmosphere, small things began to weigh heavily. Archie's curious questions about England, Lilibet's resemblance or lack thereof to Harry's side of the family. Friends and acquaintances making harmless remarks about the children's looks that struck Harry harder than they should have. Each comment was a needle, each observation a spark. Harry didn't speak of it, not at first, but the doubt was beginning to form. It wasn't suspicion of Meghan's loyalty that troubled him. It was something more complex. A fear that fate had once again set him up for heartbreak. As the months passed, Meghan's public appearances increased while Harry's grew fewer. When he did appear beside her, observers noticed his withdrawn demeanor. He smiled when expected, spoke when prompted, but his eyes rarely lifted from the ground. Even in interviews, when asked about his family, he paused longer than necessary. Behind every pause was a thought he didn't dare say aloud. Friends later recalled that during this period, he became obsessed with truth. Truth about his past, his upbringing, his future. That obsession, once abstract, began to take a more personal form. The tension inside the palace may have ended when Harry left, but the palace inside his mind remained alive. Every room of his memory still held ghosts. His mother's voice, his father's distance, his brother's disappointment. He had escaped the institution, but not the inheritance of pain that came with it. Meghan tried to offer reassurance, but Harry's introspection was no longer about public perception. It was about his private sense of belonging. Who was he without the royal lineage that defined him? Who was he if even that lineage might not flow through the next generation? This was the paradox of Harry's life. He had rejected the monarchy, but still measured his existence by its standards. He wanted to redefine what it meant to be a royal, yet could not untangle himself from the idea that blood defines legacy. And as that belief began to clash with unspoken doubts about his own children, the tension that once lived in palaces now lived within his heart. Each day became a negotiation between love and fear, loyalty and truth. By the time the pandemic forced the world into isolation, Harry's inner conflict had reached its quiet peak. Lockdown offered no distractions, only mirrors. The absence of noise made room for thoughts he could no longer suppress. Meghan spent her days managing projects remotely, but Harry spent his pacing. He reread old letters from his mother, revisited old photos, and found himself staring at faces. His own, his children's, and searching for patterns that would either confirm or dissolve his unease. It was during this period that he began therapy more intensively, opening up about loss, trauma, and identity. Yet even therapy couldn't quiet the one question he refused to articulate. What if his family, the one he built to escape the pain of the past, was itself built on another secret? In that silence, the truth began to beckon. The palace that had once controlled his every move was thousands of miles away, yet its invisible hand still guided him toward confrontation. Every generation of royals has its defining scandal, but Harry's would not come from politics or tradition. It would come from the search for authenticity in a world built on appearances. The tension that once existed between prince and institution had now turned inward, a struggle between illusion and honesty. And for a man who had spent his life trying to live as his mother taught him, to follow truth even when it hurts, the next step would be inevitable. Because the deeper the tension became, the closer Harry came to the one decision that would change everything. To find out once and for all whether the blood he fought to protect truly flowed through the children he called his own. It began not with drama, but with quiet calculation. The moment that would change everything for Prince Harry started as a whisper in his own mind. A question he couldn't shake, one that returned each night no matter how many times he tried to silence it. For months, maybe years, he had pushed it aside, convincing himself it was paranoia, a cruel byproduct of growing up in a world where trust was always conditional. But deep down, he knew this question wouldn't rest until he faced it. When the idea of a DNA test first came to him, it wasn't suspicion that drove it. It was confusion, the ache of uncertainty that had built up over time. He had always loved Archie and Lilibet without hesitation, but as the cracks in his marriage widened, so too did his doubts. It wasn't one incident that triggered it. It was the slow accumulation of small things. A careless comment, a photograph, a comparison made by a friend. Each moment added a weight to his chest until the need for truth outweighed his fear of what that truth might destroy. Harry had lived his entire life under the world's microscope. Cameras documented his first smile, his first heartbreak, his every mistake. Yet this investigation, this search for answers, had to remain unseen. It was not for the press, not for the public, not even for Meghan. It was a journey inward, into the dark corners of his own doubts. He told no one, not even his therapist. He simply made the arrangements quietly, using trusted intermediaries far removed from royal circles or Hollywood networks. The plan was simple but meticulous. Samples would be collected discreetly, no fanfare, no paperwork bearing recognizable names. He took every precaution possible, paranoid that any leak would become front-page news before he even had a chance to read the results. Trust was a currency he had long ago run out of, so he relied only on himself. He remembered the day clearly. The air outside was heavy with fog, the kind that blurs the edges of everything. Meghan was away for a meeting, and the house was quiet. The children were with their nanny. Alone in his study, Harry placed 2 envelopes on the desk, one marked for Archie, one for Lilibet. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at them. The act felt wrong, invasive, but he told himself it was necessary. The truth, however painful, was better than uncertainty. He had lived through enough lies, from the palace, the press, and sometimes those closest to him. The courier arrived just before dusk, a nondescript man in a dark jacket, unaware of the magnitude of what he was carrying. The samples were sent off to a private lab overseas, one that promised total confidentiality and operated under numbers rather than names. Even the payment was routed through a third party. There could be no mistakes, no leaks. For weeks afterward, Harry tried to carry on as normal, but his mind was restless. Every interaction with his children felt heightened, almost unbearable. He would watch Archie playing in the garden, laughing, running, and his heart would twist. Then guilt would strike immediately for even questioning the bond he'd felt from the first moment he'd held him. At night, sleep was impossible. He found himself walking the grounds of his home in Montecito, the stillness broken only by the ocean's distant hum. In those hours, memories returned. Fragments of conversations, looks, moments that now seemed to carry new meaning. He thought of the early days of Meghan's pregnancy with Archie, how guarded she'd been, how quickly rumors had been shut down by her team. At the time, he'd admired her control. Now, that control frightened him. Weeks turned into months. Every email notification sent a jolt through him. Every unknown number on his phone made his stomach tighten. Then, one afternoon, the message arrived. It was brief, a digital confirmation that the results were ready, accompanied by instructions to log in using a private access code. He sat alone at his desk, staring at the computer screen. For several minutes, he couldn't move. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. He thought about closing the laptop, deleting the message, pretending none of this had ever happened. But he knew that once a question like this enters the mind, it cannot be buried. He entered the code. What he saw next didn't feel real. The words were clinical, detached, stripped of emotion. Percentages, markers, identifiers, cold data presented in sterile language. But one line, clear and inescapable, shattered him. No biological relationship detected. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt, sounds distorted into a distant hum. He read the line again, then again, as if repetition could alter its meaning. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. He closed the laptop, pressed his palms into his eyes, and stayed there for a long time. When he finally looked up, the light outside had faded into darkness. He didn't cry at first. The shock was too heavy, too consuming. His body felt numb, as though his mind had detached itself from reality to survive the blow. Slowly, confusion began to seep in, followed by anger, grief, and disbelief. His thoughts spun wildly, questions colliding with memories. Had Meghan known? Was this deliberate? Was there some explanation he couldn't yet see? But with every attempt to rationalize, the same line from that report echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. No biological relationship detected. Hours passed before he moved. He poured himself a drink, then another. For a man who had spent years advocating for mental health and self-awareness, he suddenly found himself reverting to the habits he thought he had conquered. The whiskey burned, but it also grounded him. He needed the sting, the rawness. He needed to feel something that wasn't confusion. The next morning, the world went on as usual. Meetings, phone calls, obligations, but Harry wasn't there. He went through the motions, numb, haunted by a secret too heavy to speak. When Meghan returned, she noticed the shift immediately. His words were fewer, his eyes distant. She asked if something was wrong. He said he was fine. He wasn't ready to tell her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He spent the following days in silence, oscillating between disbelief and rage. Part of him wanted to demand answers, but another part feared the confirmation of what he already knew. What if Meghan denied it? What if she admitted it? Either outcome would break him in different ways. He thought of his mother again. How she had been trapped in a marriage built on lies. How her pursuit of truth had cost her everything. Was he destined to repeat her tragedy? But unlike Diana, Harry had one advantage: choice. He could confront, he could walk away, or he could hide the truth forever. Each option carried its own kind of destruction. To speak meant detonating his family and his public image. To stay silent meant living with a lie. There was no version of this story where he emerged unscathed. As the weight of his discovery settled, Harry began to notice something almost cruel in its timing. The very project he and Meghan had been working on, promoting authenticity, mental health, and transparency, now stood in stark contrast to the secret festering within their home. Every interview about honesty now felt like a performance. Every speech about vulnerability rang hollow. He had built a public identity on truth, but now that truth was a threat. He told himself he needed more evidence, that maybe the results were wrong, a technical error. He ordered a second test through a different facility with the same precautions. The waiting this time was worse, because deep down he already knew what it would say. When the second report arrived weeks later, it confirmed the first. 2 results. Same conclusion. The truth was undeniable. That night, Harry sat alone again, but this time he cried. Not the public tears of a prince recalling his mother, not the measured emotion of an advocate. These were the raw, shaking sobs of a man whose identity had been dismantled piece by piece. He had fought his entire life to escape being defined by bloodlines. Yet now, the absence of that bloodline was breaking him. The next step was inevitable. Secrets, once known, demand exposure. He knew he couldn't live like this forever, but the thought of confronting Meghan terrified him. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about unraveling the one relationship that had given him purpose since leaving the crown. How could he accuse her without destroying what little trust remained? How could he stay silent without destroying himself? Days turned into a blur. The mansion, once filled with warmth and light, now felt like a tomb. Harry avoided eye contact, avoided questions, avoided truth. But truth has a way of finding its voice, even when unspoken. It lingered in every glance, in every silence between them. Meghan knew something was wrong, but she couldn't have guessed how deep the wound went. And as the days passed, the burden of knowing became unbearable. He began to draft words in his head, sentences he might one day say, though each one felt impossible. I know the truth. I saw the results. Tell me why. He practiced them in front of the mirror, then abandoned them. There was no version of this confrontation that didn't end in devastation. But the moment was coming, and he knew it. Because once truth takes root in a man's heart, it grows, slow, relentless, unstoppable. And for Prince Harry, that truth had already begun tearing through the last illusions of the life he thought he understood. The evening that followed would mark the collapse of everything Prince Harry believed he knew about his life. The results had already broken him in silence, but what came next, the confrontation, the confession, and the aftermath, would leave scars that would never fully heal. The day began like any other, at least on the surface. The California sun filtered through the curtains of their Montecito home, painting gold streaks across the living room floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and ocean salt. But inside Harry, there was a storm brewing, quiet, cold, and absolute. He had spent the previous night awake, pacing, replaying every memory he'd ever shared with Meghan, every moment that now felt tainted by the words from that report. No biological relationship detected. By morning, he was no longer the same man. The prince who once charged into battlefields and braved global media storms now sat trembling in his own home, terrified of a conversation with the woman he loved. Yet he knew he couldn't hide forever. Secrets are like pressure, unseen but always growing. And that morning, it became unbearable. When Meghan walked into the kitchen, she immediately sensed something was off. Harry's face was pale, his hands clasped tightly around a mug he wasn't drinking from. She asked him what was wrong. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, long and suffocating, until she repeated the question, her voice sharper this time. I know, he said finally. 2 words, quiet but lethal. Meghan froze. Know what? Harry's throat tightened. The truth, he said. About Archie. About Lilibet. I had to know. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw the results. The color drained from Meghan's face. For a moment, she didn't speak. Her eyes darted toward him, then away, as if searching for an escape. Then came the anger, sharp, defensive, instinctive. You did what? She demanded. You tested our children? Without telling me? Harry didn't answer. His silence was its own admission. The room seemed to shrink around them. The hum of the refrigerator became deafening. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer against the truth hanging between them. Meghan's voice shook, half fury, half disbelief. How could you even think? How could you doubt me like that? But Harry's pain had reached a point where guilt no longer silenced him. He slammed the laptop onto the table, the report still open. The words stared back at them like an executioner's sentence. Because nothing makes sense anymore, he shouted. Because I've spent years defending you, fighting everyone. My family, the press. And all this time I didn't know what was real. Meghan stepped back as if struck. Her expression shifted from shock to heartbreak, then to something colder. You've lost your mind, she whispered. After everything we've been through, this is what you think of me? But Harry's tears were already falling. "It's not what I think," he said, voice breaking. "It's what I saw." For several minutes, neither of them moved. The silence was heavier than words. Meghan's breathing was shallow, her hands trembling. Finally, she turned away, pressing her palms to her temples. "Those results don't mean anything," she said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. "They're wrong. They have to be wrong." Harry watched her closely, hoping desperately for a denial strong enough to make him believe again. But what he saw instead was uncertainty, a flicker of something unspoken in her eyes. That flicker was all it took to confirm what he feared. His voice grew softer, almost pleading. "Just tell me the truth, Meg. Please. I can take anything, but not another lie." Her response came like a whisper, almost lost beneath her breath. "It's not what you think." But for Harry, it was already too late. The moment those results appeared on the screen, a part of him had died. Now, hearing her hesitation, the rest began to crumble. He left the room before she could speak again. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. He wandered into the garden, where sunlight filtered through olive trees and birds chirped in oblivious harmony. He collapsed into a chair, hands shaking, tears streaking down his face. For a man who had built his identity around defiance, against the palace, the press, the world, this was a defeat unlike any other. Every cause he had fought for, every sacrifice he'd made, suddenly felt meaningless. He thought of Diana, how she'd warned him to follow his heart, how she'd suffered in silence while surrounded by lies. And now here he was, repeating history in a different costume. Hours passed before he returned inside. Meghan was sitting at the edge of the couch, staring at nothing. Her eyes were red, her posture rigid. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but the edge remained. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Harry didn't answer. "You've destroyed everything," she continued. "The trust, the family, our future, everything." He almost laughed, though it came out hollow. "I destroyed it? Meghan, the truth destroyed it. I just found it." She turned to him then, eyes wet but fierce. "You think you know the truth? You don't. You have no idea what I've been through, what I've protected you from." Her words were strange, layered with. Meghan sat in silence for hours that morning, her hands pressed against her face, staring at the space where Harry had stood the night before. The room still carried the echoes of their argument, the fragments of words flung in pain, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her mind was a whirlpool of disbelief, fear, and a strange, piercing sadness. For a woman who had built her life on composure, on controlling every narrative that touched her name, she suddenly found herself drowning in one she couldn't contain. When Harry had said those words, "I know the truth," she had felt the world collapse inward. It wasn't only the exposure or even the accusation. It was the realization that the fortress she had built around them, brick by brick, with secrecy and protection as its foundation, had finally cracked. For years, she had fought the press, the palace, the endless speculation. But she hadn't anticipated that the ultimate battle would be against her own husband. In the days that followed, Meghan's demeanor changed. The fire that usually animated her public presence dimmed. She moved through the house quietly, speaking little, her expression unreadable. Harry watched her with a kind of detached sorrow. Part of him wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to make the silence less unbearable. But every time their eyes met, the weight of betrayal suffocated whatever compassion remained. They began living separate lives under the same roof. Meghan spent hours in her study, taking calls, meeting with her staff, appearing on video conferences where her smile was perfectly timed and her voice calm and measured. To the world, nothing had changed. She was still the poised duchess, the advocate, the symbol of reinvention. But behind those screens, the walls were closing in. She had learned long ago that silence could be both a shield and a prison. For Harry, the silence became poison. He tried to lose himself in routine. Morning runs, charity meetings, long drives with no destination, but no amount of movement could quiet his thoughts. The images from that night replayed endlessly. Her expression, the half-confession, the words left hanging in the air. He wondered if she was truly guilty of deception or simply trapped by circumstances. Yet, no matter how he tried to rationalize it, the wound refused to heal. Then one night, the confrontation they'd both been avoiding finally came. It was late past midnight. The house was dark except for the light spilling from Meghan's study. Harry stood in the doorway for several minutes before speaking. "We can't go on like this," he said softly. She didn't look up from the papers in front of her. "Go on like what?" "Pretending," he replied. "Living in the same house, breathing the same air, and pretending this isn't destroying us." Her pen froze midair. Slowly, she raised her head. "You want to talk about pretending?" she said. "You've been pretending for years, Harry. Pretending you left that family behind. Pretending you're happy here. Pretending you can build a new life without carrying the old one into it." The words cut deep, and she knew it. But Harry didn't flinch. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "But I've never lied to you. Not once." Meghan's jaw tightened. "And you think I have?" "I don't know what to think anymore." His voice cracked. "All I know is that the life I thought we built together, it's not what it seemed. You've been hiding something, and I need to hear you say what it is." For a moment, her expression softened. The defensive edge fell away, replaced by something that looked almost like regret. She stood and walked toward the window, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. "You think it's that simple," she said, her voice distant, "that there's some clean answer that makes sense of all this. But life doesn't work that way. Not in our world." Harry took a step closer. "Then help me understand." She turned then, and he saw the tears glinting in her eyes. "Do you have any idea what it's like to live under a microscope every day? To have every decision you make, every word you speak, twisted and weaponized against you? I did what I had to do to protect our family. To protect you." "Protect me?" His voice rose. "From what?" "From the truth. From everything," she said, almost shouting now. "From the world that wanted to destroy us. From the people who would never let us live in peace. From a system that would have crushed our children before they could even speak." The room pulsed with tension. Harry's heart pounded. "So you lied to me to protect me?" Meghan's breath caught. "You wouldn't have understood," she whispered. "Not then." "Try me now," he said. She hesitated. There was something behind her eyes. A secret she was still guarding, even after everything. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she finally said. "I never meant for you to find out like this." Those words, vague and incomplete, hit harder than any confession. They confirmed what he already knew, that the truth existed, that it had been hidden from him deliberately. "You had a choice," he said quietly, "and you chose to keep me in the dark." Tears streamed down Meghan's face now. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to live like this, carrying the weight of something I couldn't explain? You think I haven't suffered every single day?" Harry stared at her, torn between anger and pity. He wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. He still loved her. That was the cruelest part. Love had been the one constant in a life full of betrayal, and now even that was tainted. Meghan sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "If I told you everything," she said, her voice muffled, "you'd never forgive me." "Then tell me anyway," he said. The silence stretched again. When she finally spoke, her words came in fragments. "There were pressures," she began. "There were things I couldn't control, people I couldn't say no to. The palace, the doctors, the media, it was all chaos. I was scared, Harry. I was scared of what would happen if they found out the truth before I could protect us." Her explanation didn't make sense, not fully, but in that moment it didn't need to. What mattered was the realization that she had lived with fear, just as he had. Fear had been their common language all along, hidden beneath love and defiance. But fear couldn't erase what was already done. "So you chose silence," he said. "And now we're both paying for it." She looked up at him, her eyes red but steady. "You can hate me if you want," she said. "But don't pretend you don't understand. You've been running from your own truth your entire life. The words hit their mark. Harry turned away, unable to look at her. He thought of all the years he had spent blaming the institution for his pain, blaming the press, blaming anyone but himself. Maybe she was right. Maybe the real enemy wasn't outside. It was the silence inside both of them. After that night, they didn't speak for days. The confrontation had burned through what little was left between them. Meghan threw herself into her work again, using purpose as a shield. Harry spent his days walking the cliffs overlooking the Pacific, trying to find meaning in the wreckage. For the first time since leaving the royal family, Harry felt truly alone. Not just physically, but existentially. Every pillar of his life, family, marriage, identity, had crumbled. He had no kingdom, no home, no certainty. Only truth, raw and merciless, staring him in the face. And yet, somewhere deep in that devastation, a small, defiant spark remained. Maybe it was the same fire that had driven him to protect Meghan against the world. Maybe it was his mother's legacy, whispering to him that love, even broken, was still worth fighting for. He didn't know what forgiveness would look like, or if it was even possible. But he knew he couldn't live inside the silence any longer. The confrontation had stripped them bare. No more lies, no more illusions. Whatever came next would have to be real. Because in that moment, as he stood by the window watching the waves crash against the California shore, Prince Harry finally understood that truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it just changes the prison you live in. The news reached London before dawn. A quiet message, passed through encrypted channels, first landed on the desk of a senior aide at Clarence House. Within hours, it was in the hands of the king's private secretary. By mid-morning, the whispers had reached Buckingham Palace, Kensington, and even Windsor, and the story spreading through those gilded corridors carried a shock unlike any other. Prince Harry's private turmoil had always been a subject of fascination, but this was different. If true, it was not just scandal, it was crisis. The monarchy, already fragile after years of division and loss, was facing a revelation that struck at its oldest foundation: lineage. King Charles III received the report at breakfast. The morning light spilled through the high windows of Clarence House as he set down his teacup, his expression unreadable. The page in front of him contained a brief summary, a mention of DNA results, a potential breach of trust, and the disturbing implication that Archie and Lilibet might not be of royal blood. The document was unsigned, discreetly phrased, but its meaning was unmistakable. For a long time he didn't move. He had known pain before: betrayal, humiliation, the public collapse of love. But this hit differently. Harry was his son, the boy who had once clung to him during moments of unbearable grief. And now, at 41, that same boy had set off a storm that could ripple through generations. When the private secretary entered the room, Charles finally spoke, his voice calm but low. "We don't speak of this outside this office." "Not yet. Not until I've seen confirmation." "Yes, Your Majesty," the aide replied. But inside, Charles knew there would be no containing it for long. In the modern age, even silence leaks. At Kensington Palace, Prince William received the same news hours later, though in a more direct form: a brief, coded message from one of the senior communications officers. He read it twice, then sat down heavily, his phone still in hand. For all the tension that had grown between the brothers, he had never imagined it could come to this. Their relationship had endured jealousy, anger, separation, but not disbelief. "Does father know?" he asked his aide. "Yes, sir. Early this morning." William nodded slowly, rubbing his temple. "Keep this within the tightest circle. If it's true," he trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. The irony was not lost on him. For years, the monarchy's enemies, the tabloids, the critics, the internet conspiracists, had speculated about Harry's own paternity, spreading cruel theories about his resemblance to others. And now, fate had turned that same cruel lens on Harry himself. William wasn't sure whether to feel anger, pity, or fear. He simply felt the weight of inevitability. The Queen Consort, too, heard the whispers before lunch. Seated in her private sitting room, she sighed deeply when the message reached her. "The boy always did chase storms," she murmured to an aide. "But this one may drown him." By the afternoon, the palace press team had convened an emergency meeting. The goal was simple: containment. They couldn't confirm, they couldn't deny, not until they had facts. But in an institution built on secrecy, the truth was often irrelevant. Perception was everything. "The narrative must be controlled before the media gets hold of it," one advisor said sharply. "We need unity, not panic. This cannot appear to divide the family further." Another added, "If the report's existence leaks, we position it as private speculation. Emotional stress, family gossip, nothing verified." But Charles wasn't listening to strategy. He was thinking of his son, the red-haired boy he had once carried through gardens, now a man unraveling thousands of miles away. Despite everything, the interviews, the books, the accusations, a father's instinct still stirred within him. He sent a message through secure channels. "I've heard troubling things. Please speak to me directly before others do." The message went unanswered. At Montecito, Harry saw it flash across his phone but couldn't bring himself to respond. What could he say? That the family who'd once doubted his every move now had reason to doubt his bloodline? That the shame and confusion he carried had finally crossed the ocean to stain the very institution he'd tried to escape? He placed the phone face down and stared out at the horizon. In London, the palace walls began to hum with speculation. Staff whispered in corridors, carefully avoiding eye contact. Courtiers compared notes, old friends exchanged private messages, and reporters began circling like sharks sensing blood. The monarchy had weathered scandals before, affairs, divorces, abdications, but this was different. This wasn't about conduct or image. It was about legitimacy. In royal terms, that word was sacred. Without bloodline, there was no succession. Without succession, there was no monarchy. Senior officials debated what would happen if the rumors proved true. Would the children lose their titles? Would their places in the line of succession be quietly erased? How would the public react if they learned that the supposed heirs of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex bore no Windsor blood? The questions multiplied faster than the answers could keep up. Meanwhile, William remained silent. For all their differences, he knew this was not a moment for public reaction. Behind closed doors, he was torn between brotherly loyalty and institutional duty. As the heir to the throne, he could not afford sentiment. But as a brother, he could not ignore the pain he knew Harry must be enduring. He remembered their mother's voice, her warning that the world would always test their bond. And now, decades later, that test had reached its cruelest form. That night, a private call took place between the king and his eldest son. "This must not reach the press," Charles said, his tone clipped. "I know," William replied, "but it will. It's too big. Someone will talk." Charles exhaled, weary. "Then we manage it. The crown must stand above the noise." "And Harry?" The king paused. "He's made his choice." There was a silence that stretched between them, long and heavy. For once, neither man spoke as monarch nor heir, but as father and son. Both understood that this revelation, even if never made public, had already changed everything. Within a week, the story began leaking in fragments. A tabloid published a cryptic headline, "Shock tests rock the Sussex household." Another followed with, "Royal lineage questioned in private family dispute." The palace issued a brief statement, "We do not comment on personal matters." But the damage was done. Across Britain, speculation erupted like wildfire. Talk shows, online forums, and social media threads dissected every detail. Was it true? Were the children really not Harry's? Was this the final break between the Windsors and the Sussexes? Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood was somber but resolute. The monarchy had survived crises before, but this was a different battlefield. The challenge now wasn't just about reputation, it was about preserving belief. In a world obsessed with scandal, the royal family had always relied on the illusion of continuity. But if the illusion shattered, what would remain? As the headlines multiplied, the king's private secretary approached him one evening with a quiet question. "Shall we prepare a contingency, Your Majesty?" in case the results are confirmed publicly? Charles didn't look up from his papers. We prepare for everything, he said softly, but we speak of nothing. Still, those who saw him closely in the days that followed noticed a change. He appeared older, slower, as though the weight of the crown had grown heavier overnight. During one official engagement, when asked about his sons by a well-meaning diplomat, he hesitated before replying, "Family is complicated." It was the most honest thing he'd said in years. In Montecito, Harry watched the storm unfold from afar. The irony was cruel. After years of trying to control his own narrative, he had once again lost it. This time, not to the tabloids or the monarchy, but to the truth he himself had unleashed. He turned off his phone and sat in silence, the ocean breeze whispering through the windows. For the first time, he realized that exile wasn't distance, it was isolation. And somewhere across the Atlantic, behind guarded palace walls, his father sat alone at his desk, staring at a framed photograph of two little boys in uniform, laughing together on a sunny afternoon long ago. He traced a finger across the glass and whispered to no one, "What happened to us?" Neither of them knew that the answer to that question, painful, royal, and human, would soon define the future of the monarchy itself. The morning after the palace statement, the world erupted. The story, now public, had broken free from whispers and anonymous sources. It was everywhere. Headlines screamed across front pages in London, New York, and Sydney. Royal lineage in question. DNA bombshell rocks the House of Windsor. Harry's truth. A family torn apart. The words were bold, relentless, impossible to escape. Television anchors delivered their updates with voices that mixed shock and fascination. In the digital age, outrage and curiosity spread faster than any official denial could contain. Social media platforms became battlegrounds. Within minutes, #RoyalDNA, #Harry'sTruth, and #Archie Lillibet trended worldwide. Millions debated, dissected, and speculated. Some users offered sympathy. He's human. Everyone deserves to know the truth. Others were merciless. He's destroyed the monarchy for attention. Even among those who had once idolized the Sussexes, confusion set in. Had the couple been victims of circumstance, or architects of their own downfall? Morning talk shows filled their panels with royal experts, psychologists, and body language analysts. Each replayed clips from Harry and Meghan's past interviews, the Oprah conversation, the Netflix series, the documentaries, and scrutinized every word, every glance. "Look here," one analyst said, pointing to Meghan's subtle hand movement during a clip. "That's classic stress behavior. She was hiding something." Another countered, "Or it could be anxiety from years of harassment. We can't assume guilt." Even the late-night hosts, who once joked about Harry's exit from the royal family, now spoke with an edge of discomfort. This wasn't a scandal you could laugh off. It was tragedy layered with complexity, a public unraveling of private pain. Across Britain, reactions split sharply along generational lines. The older public saw it as yet another blow to a monarchy already weakened by time. "It's disgraceful," one elderly woman told a reporter outside Buckingham Palace. "That boy's mother would never have allowed this circus." Younger Britons were less sentimental. "It's sad," said a university student. "But honestly, the whole system is outdated. Maybe it's time for the truth, no matter how ugly." In America, where Harry and Meghan had built their second life, reactions were more polarized. Supporters called it brave proof of transparency. Critics accused them of hypocrisy, preaching privacy while living in confession. Cable news